Welcome to the Lowenstein Sandler podcast series. I'm Kevin Iredell, Chief Marketing Officer at Lowenstein Sandler. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast series at lowenstein.com/podcast or find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Now let's take a listen.
Hello, and welcome to Regulatory Matters, a podcast devoted to covering the ever-changing regulatory landscape affecting business today.
This podcast is hosted by a group of women partners from the law firm of Lowenstein Sandler, who collectively cover much of that regulatory landscape. Today, I, Kathleen McGee, am here with Julie Samuels. I consider Julie Samuels a friend. She is also the executive director of Tech NYC. Before that, she was an executive director at Engine, which is a nationwide nonprofit focused on technological entrepreneurship and advocacy. She remains on that board. Earlier in her career, she worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She's an incredible booster for New York City. She loves her dog, and she's here to spend a couple minutes with us today to talk about specifically the art of making policy. So, Julie, my friend, thank you so much for joining and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such a treat.
You're very kind. But I do think that our listeners can learn a bit from you today in the short time we have about what making policy is like. And specifically in our tech world, I thought that you could contribute to helping our listeners understand a little bit more about that art. And I wanted to start by dipping into your personal and professional history, just in the sense of what you think, and this is purely subjective, what you think has really contributed most to your fundamental understanding of what makes good policy.
Well, let me start by saying that I used to be a lawyer. I used to be a litigator, in fact, and I did time in the private sector at the law firm myself, and I also worked doing impact advocacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And those years, more than anything, impacted my view on how policy is made, which is to say that policy gets made by many inputs. I think that there's this idea that there are lobbyists and there are regulators and there are legislators. And usually that's kind of where it all happens. But I have found that it's not the case. I found that the only successful way to see real policy get made, particularly in complicated areas like technology, are when you have this kind of really robust ecosystem where you have activists, frankly, every side of an issue, where you have litigators doing impact litigation, where you have successful communication strategies, and then where you also have lobbyists and companies and elected officials who are kind of battling out the details. But all of those things together really matter. And one of the first issues I worked on in my policy career, if you will, was patent reform in DC, particularly around software patents. And we worked for years pushing in the early 2010s, pushing some legislative reforms. And while I think about this all the time, because while most of those reforms ultimately were not passed by Congress, the vast majority of them ended up happening in the courts. And none of those things happen in a vacuum, right? It wasn't a coincidence that in this instance, the Supreme Court ended up taking a number of these patent cases because it was really, again, it's not in a vacuum. These things are in the zeitgeist and people are talking about them and interacting on them. And so policy gets made in all different lanes is what I'm trying to say. And that has been the most interesting and frankly fun part, I think, of my career working on policy matters.
How do you think that sort of inclusive environment for making sure all voices are heard to contribute to policy happens? Obviously, some people are going to have a very jaded perspective of policy. You sort of indicated that before, and may think that the winners really just signify money and a weighted scale. But if you're talking about something like creating, and tech policy is now a very big umbrella, but how do we ensure that all voices are heard, all perspectives are weighed?
Well, this is something that the internet has been quite helpful with. And say what you will about how the political process has been impacted by, for instance, social networks, something we're working through as a society and as a democracy, but it has also really increased engagement. has really increased political engagement. There are a number of organizations that are now incredibly powerful that, built themselves upon social networks like Twitter and Facebook. And you've seen entire movements like what grew out of the Women's March after 2016 election, what has grown out of the Black Lives Matter movement. Those movements have fundamentally changed debates. And you're seeing policy change coming, not as quickly as I would hope on some issues, but they're coming. I am optimistic that we are going to have paid leave in this country. And that is because of a lot of really dedicated, organized people, much of which started on the internet. So I am optimistic. I wish it were coming quicker, but I'm very optimistic.
It's true. One can see those seeds of change. And I think if you're looking with a policy eye, it's fascinating to see them grow from nascent ideas and movements into something that gets steam. I find it really exciting.
Yeah, I too find it really exciting. One of the dynamics there that I find really interesting and why I think so much about the ecosystem of policymaking and how it takes all types is it's really hard, I think, for activists. You need activists to push the envelope and to change the conversation. And then at the end of the day, you need people at the table, frankly, making compromises. And those two types of people don't often see eye to eye. But that's, I was hoping I would make it through the podcast without saying how the sausage is made, but I'm not gonna be able to do that. But that's how the sausage gets made. You need both sides of that. And if you don't have folks pushing the conversation farther, pushing the envelope, that gives the air cover to the people who then are at the table hammering out the deals. And when those two things are happening in concert and you've got good relationships between those two kind of sides of the equation, if you will, then you're onto something, I think.
I agree. I used to say when I was in the regulatory seat that the centrist position drives it forward by meeting those two opposing sides.
Yes.
And so I always tried to surround myself by people who represented the broadest spectrum of interests in driving tech policy forward. And then we would look for the center. Sometimes the center was to one side, sometimes the center actually was more to the other, but it was by all consensus a center, and there were always those compromises.
Yeah, I think one of the things I actually worry about in our current kind of policymaking landscape is that the center is often quite under attack. And, my personal politics, I should say, are putting those aside, my personal politics are much farther to the progressive side than the center probably, but I think the center matters, in its most basic form, in a democracy. Like that's the only way forward, as I see it. At the end of the day, is that you're going to have to again come to the table. Compromises will have to be made, and I worry that the center is so misaligned right now, is so under attack from so many angles that it makes it hard to actually get stuff done.
I share that worry, and I certainly hope the center holds, as they say.
Yes.
Let me ask you a little bit of a different question, which is your experiences in crafting policy. I certainly have had mentors along the way. Do you have a couple people that you thought that is a really great strategy for analyzing and finding that center, or pushing your own policy agenda forward as one of those voices that you wanted to be considered by the decision makers? Who were your mentors?
That's a really good question. I've been lucky to have had many mentors, and the small handful, a few who I think are the most impactful in my career are not actually people who are directly involved in policymaking. Interestingly, one former boss who was an attorney, an investor, a handful of people who are really smart at what they do, who are really thoughtful, who are able to keep things in perspective, which I think is one of the most important pieces of being good at policymaking, and who trust people around them in a way that I think is really important in policymaking. It's more than delegating. It's trusting that others know what they're talking about, are smart about what they're talking about, are prepared. And I think that, number one, really incentivizes people to do a better job. And number two, that's how you get more voices at the table. And that's the only way to encourage diversity in these conversations around policymaking, is to really trust, you have to trust that people you might not know so well, who aren't in your inner circle, perhaps, know what they're doing. And I think people rise to the occasion.
I agree. It's listening to the voice of the other people and really listening to it.
Right.
When you feel listened to, do you volunteer to contribute more? And that's an empowering thing for sure. You talked about this earlier, and you alluded to it. The difference between policy and politics. Is there a difference?
There is a difference. There is a difference. One inevitably feeds off the other to some extent. Well, I don't know. Policymaking requires politics to get done, but I think that the definition of politics is actually quite broad. And the politics I have dealt with at times in my career working in the private sector, let's say, or in the nonprofit sector. What I'm trying to say is interoffice politics are really not that different than politics among elected officials, right? It's all the same. It's how you manage relationships. It's how you maintain relationships. It's how you get information across. It's how you are able to be persuasive and, reach an end point that you want to reach. And I think when people understand that makes them better at policy making. It is, really no different than office politics, because it's all the same. It's literally the people I know who are the best at this are really good relationship people.
Well, that brings me to a question. I actually don't have a firm perspective on this myself, but I wanted to ask this of you because we're a podcast hosted by a group of women talking about regulatory policy. Do you find that female policymakers approach that problem solving differently? I certainly see a real uptick in the number of female policymakers, and I think that can be a good thing. But obviously, my perspective is just because you're female doesn't make you a good policymaker.
Right. I obviously agree with that. I will say that anecdotally, at least, I have found that when I am working with women policymakers or kind of women in my broader fields, will often kind of joke among each other, well, now we're going to be able to get something done. There's this thing in the zeitgeist. I don't know if it's, my sense is it is grounded in reality, but it's hard to know for sure, that women have this kind of feeling, most women, not all, when we're working together, it's like, oh, okay, let's just get done now. Can we swear on this podcast? Sorry.
I think we have.
Yeah. And that happens. And I think when a group of women kind of sit down and commit to accomplishing something, they're much more interested in seeing the outcome at the end. I think that's something kind of in our society. I think that's something because women were cut out of this for so long. I think this is because women are used to juggling a bazillion different things in our lives that happens. And I'm seeing that happen in the policymaking space. And I'm incredibly encouraged. I'm incredibly encouraged by it.
That's wonderful. I wanted to ask about maybe your most favorite or most challenging piece of policymaking to date. I hope you have years of policymaking
ahead of me.
But, and I do want to make sure that we touch on your most recent campaign for New York City this past year, which I think has been incredible.
Yeah,
but
it's been amazing.
That's a favorite of yours, but I want to hear about what you think is.
Yeah, the most challenging. Oh gosh, this is such a hard question. I mean, it's interesting because I've always really focused on tech policy. And earlier in my career, tech was really an underdog. And we worked on issues like patent reform that I already talked about. We worked on killing legislation called SOPA and PIPA, which some people might remember, almost a decade ago now, I guess. And then there were a lot of victories happening because tech was beloved. And since then, obviously, the politics around technology, which we didn't really talk about, they've shifted. And the battles now are of a very different flavor. They're a lot harder. Because public opinion is tough right now in some of these issues. And I think the biggest challenge, particularly around issues like data privacy, which I know you all think a lot about, is that Congress has just completely not been able to get anything done. And I have spent time in the more time in the past few years working on these issues at the state level and sometimes even at the local level. And from where I sit and from the perspective of the companies I work with, particularly the smaller companies, particularly the startups and the growing companies, is that state by state solutions are just not going to work here. They're going to just, encourage the biggest companies, frankly, to thrive because they're the ones who can afford it. And I worry about that. So that doesn't answer your question directly because it's not a specific piece of legislation, but I guess we can talk about data privacy. And I can say I've been discouraged that we haven't seen more federal progress and that we've been left to kind of battle it out in the states, which I think is not helpful in the long run.
I agree. It does not create a level playing field. It weights the winner. And
Right.
When you talk to other jurisdictions internationally, I may not love their ultimate solution, but they have one. And then they can work within that. And they are pairing up their data privacy solutions with ideas of competitiveness and ensuring that the field is a little more level for startups, which is incredibly important. I agree. Quickly, New York City campaign. Talk about how much you love New York City. Because you love this year. You've shown New York City so much.
New York City.
So much love.
I was here I've been here pretty much the whole time since 2020. I love New York City. I believe in New York City, and got together with a group of friends and we created an organization called New York Forever, which is at nyforever.nyc. Also has a great Instagram account at New York Forever on Twitter, anywhere you find your content. But really just kind of an effort to celebrate the city, to bring New Yorkers together to help support the city and its recovery. And it's absolutely a labor of love. Listen, I'm here in the city. I'm raising my family here. As Kathleen, you said, I have my dog who I love. I walk every morning in the park and my kids go to school here and we're committed. And I think that we have this amazing opportunity. I mean, it's been a really tough, obviously it's been a really tough year and a half, but we have this amazing opportunity to think about how we rebuild New York City equitably, how we make it work for people who live here, how we put New Yorkers first as we think about the future of New York City. And that's amazing. I love supporting this work. It's a true joy.
I loved it. I loved seeing people just boostering, and it just seemed like an extension of clapping on the fire escape and really people getting out there and showing each other love. It's been really great. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I did want to talk about your dog because I know you well enough to know that secretly maybe your most favorite sentient being is your dog.
I do love my dog. I love my dog. Yeah,
you guys are out there. And, usually we ask our guests about one thing people don't know about you. I'm sure all your friends know that you love your dog, but tell us about your dog.
My dog is great. Her name is Daly. She's actually named after the Chicago mayors. The thing about the dog, I think I've got 2 young kids. I have a pretty crazy job. I have a million things going on. The thing about the dog is you have to walk the dog. You have to. The dog has to go out. And so I walk the dog every morning in Central Park. Do you know before 9 a.m. dogs don't need leashes in Central Park? It's just like people and dogs. It's a dream. And I get out of myself for a few minutes and I get outside and I watch the seasons change. The leaves are still beautiful. It's December 3rd. They're still gorgeous. And it's the thing that saves me are those dog walks. They save me. I try not to look at email. While I'm out. No. But I sometimes do. But I try not to. And the walks have gotten shorter as I've gotten busier, unfortunately, and she's gotten a little bit older, but it's still, even if you can find 15 or 20 minutes to do that, it's more than that even, but it's really important.
I love it. I love your dog. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us a little insight into, I'm going to say it, how the sausage is made. Hope you continue to grind it, Julie. I really admire you. I think you're fantastic. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to our podcast series at lowenstein.com/podcast or find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Lowenstein Sandler podcast series is presented by Lowenstein Sandler and cannot be copied or rebroadcast without consent. The information provided is intended for a general audience and is not legal advice or a substitute for the advice of counsel. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship is being created by this podcast, and all rights are reserved.